Welcome back, everyone. There are some cases, some stories that really just kind of stay with you. And today we're going to be looking into one of those. We're talking about the murder of Anitra Gunn. She was a college student in Fort Valley, Georgia. This was back in 2020. And, I mean, can you imagine? Like, you're about to graduate, your whole life's ahead of you, and then suddenly you disappear. On Valentine's Day, no less.
Yeah, it's chilling, and it really, it shook that community to its core. What starts as just a missing persons report quickly turns into this really complex investigation. It exposes like this whole dark side to her relationship with her boyfriend, Demarcus Little. Well, on again, off again boyfriend, I should say.
Right. We're going to be diving deep into all of this using a YouTube documentary called She Laughed in His Face on Valentine's Day, The Murder of Anitra Gunn. It's from the channel Just Thought Launch. And I have to say, even just going through the material to prep for this, there are so many layers here, and there are a lot of things that'll make you question everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And this deep dive, it's not just about like recounting what happened. We're gonna like analyze the relationship dynamics, the investigation, really get into like the psychology of what was going on, both for Anitra and to Marcus and the people around them.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. It's Valentine's Day 2020. And Anitra's best friend, Sierra, wakes up to some texts from Anitra's phone. Seems normal enough at first, but then things get strange.
Yeah, you have those like initial Valentine's Day messages, which, fit Anitra's personality. But then they take this weird turn. They get really suggestive, almost like, she's about to hook up with some random guy. And that was so out of character for her.
And this is where the first red flag pops up, right? Because this was during one of Anitra's off-again periods with Demarcus Little, who we mentioned earlier was a U.S. Army sergeant.
Exactly. Now, a few odd texts, they might not seem like a huge deal on their own, but knowing that Anitra was in this, kind of volatile relationship, it immediately raises concern.
So what happened next? Did Sierra try to call Anitra?
She did, yeah, but Anitra wasn't answering. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Another one of Anitra's friends, a guy named David Scoot Howard, he starts getting these weird messages too, similar to the one Sierra was getting.
Wait, hold on. Scoot Howard, but you said they were barely friends, so why was he getting these texts? Supposedly from Anitra.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one of the first hints that something is really, really wrong. These messages, they weren't just out of character. They seemed like they were almost designed to mislead. Like someone was trying to paint this picture of Anitra being with someone else,
Okay, so now you have Sierra and Scoot getting these bizarre messages, and Anitra's still nowhere to be found. What about Demarcus? Did he try to contact anybody?
He did, yeah. He contacted both Sierra and Scoot, claiming, he had no idea where Anitra was. But if you look closely, his actions kind of tell a different story. Well, remember that damaged white Chevy Cruze that was found abandoned near where Anitra's phone was eventually found? Whose fingerprints do you think were all over it?
Oh no, Demarcus's.
Demarcus's. And this, along with what Scoot would later testify to, that he saw Demarcus's car circling his block while he was receiving those strange texts, it really starts to, shift the focus of the investigation.
Wait, back up. So Scoot saw Demarcus's car while those texts were coming in. That's chilling. It almost seems like Demarcus was trying to create a false trail, like make it seem like Anitra was with Scoot that morning.
Right, and it really makes you wonder if Demarcus was truly worried about Anitra, wouldn't he be, focused on finding her instead of driving around Scoot's neighborhood?
Okay, so we've got these strange texts. We have a damaged car. Demarcus is acting super suspicious. This is already feeling less like a missing persons case and more like, well, something much worse.
Yeah, you're picking up on the same vibes that investigators were starting to feel at this point. And remember, all of this is happening while Anitra's father, Christopher, is making this agonizing drive from Atlanta down to Fort Valley, knowing in his gut that something is terribly wrong.
Oh, man. He must have been beside himself with worry.
Absolutely. And he ends up being the one to actually officially file that missing persons report, and that sets off this massive search. But as the hours turn into days and the leads start to dry up, that sense of dread, it just starts to sink in.
So what was the next big break in the case?
Well, it came with the discovery of Anitra's phone, but not in the way that anyone expected. It was found stuffed inside a drainage pipe.
A drainage pipe. Come on. That's not just losing your phone. That's deliberately trying to hide something.
You got it. And sadly, that discovery, it was followed by an even more devastating one. They found Anitra's body.
Oh, man. Where did they find her?
Concealed in the woods, not far from where that car was found abandoned. And near the body, more car parts. including that missing front bumper from the Chevy Cruze.
Ugh, it's all starting to add up in the worst way possible. So was this the official cause of death?
Strangulation, with signs of head trauma. The brutality of it, it really sent shockwaves through the whole community.
This is just absolutely heartbreaking. Anitra had, so much life ahead of her, and it was stolen in such a cruel way. We're just scratching the surface here. In the next part of this deep dive, we're going to look at how the investigation really zeroes in on Demarcus Little, the evidence that emerged, and the trial that captivated the nation.
And we're going to go beyond the headlines. We'll examine the psychology of domestic violence, talk about the warning signs, the tactics that abusers use to manipulate and control their victims. Because this case, it's about more than just one tragic event. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of toxic relationships and the urgent need for prevention and intervention.
So if you're interested in understanding this case on a deeper level and really gaining some insights into these patterns of domestic violence, make sure you join us for part 2 of this deep dive into the murder of Anitra Gunn.
Welcome back. So as we, dig deeper into this case, I think it's really important to understand the context of Demarcus and Anitra's relationship. We know it was, rocky, but the trial really revealed just how troubled it truly was.
Yeah, and I mean, when Demarcus was initially arrested, it was actually for property damage at Anitra's home, weeks before she disappeared. But then this whole other layer unfolds with his friend Javon Abram taking the stand.
Yeah, Javon Abram's testimony, it became this pivotal moment in the whole trial. He told the court that Demarcus had actually confessed to him, describing, this fit of rage, a blackout, and then the horrifying act of, getting rid of Anitra's body.
And this confession, it wasn't just, like a dry account of the events, right? Didn't Javon say Demarcus actually went into detail about what triggered him?
He did, and this is where we see those, really disturbing psychological elements come into play. Demarcus allegedly told Javon that Anitra had laughed in his face when he told her he loved her and called them soulmates. And, according to Demarcus, this sent him into this blind rage that ultimately led to the tragedy.
Wow. So you have this like volatile mix, right? Possessiveness, insecurity, just a complete inability to handle rejection. I mean, it really shines a light on how dangerous those unchecked emotions can be, especially in a relationship.
Exactly. And the prosecution, they were very strategic in how they presented this narrative. They didn't just focus on the physical act of the murder. They really painted this picture of Demarcus's controlling and abusive behavior that ultimately led up to Anitra's death.
Okay, so how did they do that? Aside from Javon's testimony, what kind of evidence did they present to support that claim of abuse?
Well, they presented like months worth of text messages between Anitra and Demarcus. And these weren't your typical, lovers' quarrels. They exposed a very clear pattern of manipulation, threats, and just straight up emotional abuse.
And these messages, they must have been pretty bad to be used as evidence in court. Like, what kind of things was Demarcus saying to her?
Oh, they were incredibly incriminating. We're talking constant accusations of infidelity, threats of violence against Anitra and anyone he perceived as like a rival, and even like chilling threats of suicide if she ever tried to leave him.
It sounds like textbook emotional manipulation, right? Trying to break someone down, isolate them, make them completely dependent.
You got it. And you remember those messages that Scoot was getting from Anitra's phone on Valentine's Day, the ones where she was seemingly breaking up with him, even though they were barely friends? Well, the prosecution argued that it was actually Demarcus sending those messages from Anitra's phone to, further manipulate the situation and try to create this false alibi for himself.
Geez, it's almost like he was trying to create this whole elaborate drama with Anitra as this like unwilling participant. But what about Anitra? Did she ever push back against all of this?
The messages show that she definitely tried. You can see her trying to assert her independence, trying to set boundaries, and even actually trying to break up with him multiple times. But he would always reel her back in with apologies, promises to change, and of course, more threats.
Man, this is it's so tragic. It really speaks to that, insidious cycle of abuse where victims, they often get trapped in this web of manipulation and fear, and it makes it so difficult to escape.
And that's exactly what the prosecution, they really tried to hammer home during the trial. They used this analogy of a frog in boiling water. If you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you slowly raise the temperature, the frog won't realize the danger until it's, well, too late.
That's pretty dark, but it's a really accurate way to describe what was happening to Anitra. She was slowly being pulled deeper and deeper into this toxic relationship. And by the time she might have realized the extent of the danger, it was already too late.
Right, and it highlights just how subtle it can be. Abusers, they gain control gradually, often starting with these small acts of like manipulation and isolation that escalate over time. Demarcus, for example, he would monitor Anitra's social media, accuse her of flirting with other men, and try to limit her contact with, her friends and family.
So it's not always, like overt physical violence, right? It could be this slow, subtle erosion of their autonomy and their sense of self.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for friends and family to be aware of those subtle red flags. Changes in behavior, if someone's becoming withdrawn, if they're constantly checking in with their partner, making excuses for their partner's behavior. I mean, these can all be signs that something is wrong.
Right. Okay, but even with, Javon's testimony and these, like, pretty incriminating text messages, there was some pushback from DeMarcus's family, right? I mean, they were adamant that he was innocent.
Oh, absolutely. His family, they fiercely defended him. They portrayed him as like, a good kid, a dedicated soldier, someone who would never hurt anyone. And, this brings up a really important point. How do we differentiate between genuine support and just a flat out refusal to acknowledge the truth, even when the evidence is staring you right in the face?
It's a tough question. It speaks to the complexity of these situations. I mean, how can you wrap your head around the fact that someone you love could be capable of something so horrific?
It's a natural human response to want to believe the best in the people we care about, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. But it's important to remember that denial, it can be incredibly damaging, not only for the families involved, but also for potential future victims. Because if the abuser's actions are, minimized or excused, it allows the cycle to continue.
So in this case, did the jury, like, buy DeMarcus's defense? Did they believe that he was, this good kid who just snapped?
Well, after hearing all of the evidence, including those, disturbing text messages and Javon's testimony, the jury deliberated for about 3 hours before reaching a verdict.
And what was the verdict?
Guilty.
Guilty of?
Guilty of felony murder and aggravated assault. That frog and boiling water analogy that the prosecution used, it really seemed to resonate with the jury.
Wow. So what was the sentence?
Life without the possibility of parole.
That's a heavy sentence. So now that we've gone through the investigation, the trial, I think it's important to kind of like shift gears for a second and talk about the bigger picture. What can we, as listeners, what can we take away from this tragic case?
Absolutely. And one of the most important takeaways, as we've touched on, is recognizing the signs of domestic violence. It's not always, black and blue. It can manifest in these subtle ways through emotional manipulation, isolation, and this like gradual erosion of a victim's sense of self.
Right, and it's easy to get, caught up in the legal aspects of this case, but at its core, this is a story about a young woman whose life was cut short. And it's a reminder that, we as a society, we need to do better. We need to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
You're absolutely right. And so as we move into the final part of this deep dive, we'll talk about the resources that are out there for victims of domestic violence. We'll discuss the role that bystanders can play, and we'll examine some of those societal norms that often, sadly contribute to this perpetuation of abuse.
So stick with us as we unpack some of these really critical aspects of this conversation. Because, understanding is the first step towards prevention. And breaking the silence is absolutely crucial for creating a safer world for everyone. It's so easy to get caught up in, like, the courtroom drama and the evidence and the verdict. But at the end of the day, this is about, a life that was lost, a young woman with dreams and aspirations. It makes you think, what if someone had intervened? What if there were more support systems, in place for her?
Yeah, you've hit on a really, really crucial point. Anitra's case, I mean, it's this stark reminder that we need to be doing more than just reacting to these tragedies. We have to be, like, proactive in preventing domestic violence.
So where do we even begin? It feels like such a huge, complex issue.
It is. It's definitely complex, but that doesn't mean that it's, impossible to tackle. One of the most important things we can do is educate ourselves and others about, those warning signs. And remember, it's not always, like, physical.
Right, we talked about that, the emotional manipulation, the controlling behavior, the isolation tactics. But let's say, you notice those things in someone a friend, a family member, but what's the next step? How do you even approach that conversation?
It's it's delicate for sure, but I think approaching them with genuine concern and just a willingness to listen can really make a world of difference. Just let them know you're there for them without judgment. And importantly, provide them with, some resources.
Resources, like what? What kind of resources?
Well, there's, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They offer support 24/7, safety planning, connections to local resources, shelters, support groups, legal aid services. It's about empowering people, giving them options.
That's good to know. What about bystanders, though? I mean, sometimes it's not even a close friend, right? Maybe it's a coworker or someone you just kind of know who notices that something seems off.
Yeah, bystanders, they absolutely have a role to play. It can be as simple as just checking in on someone who seems withdrawn, offering a listening ear, or, just even voicing your concern. Sometimes that small act, that just acknowledging the situation, can be such a lifeline for someone who feels trapped.
It's tragic to think that Anitra, like, in a way, she reached out on Valentine's Day through those bizarre texts. What if someone had recognized that as a cry for help?
It's heartbreaking, and it really emphasizes, how important it is to trust our instincts. If something feels off, if someone's behavior seems really different, don't just dismiss it. Reach out, offer support, let them know they're not alone.
This whole conversation is giving me realize, like, it's not just about individual responsibility, right? It's a collective effort to shift those societal norms. We need to create a culture where victims feel safe speaking out, where abuse is never tolerated or minimized.
Exactly. We need to challenge those harmful attitudes that, allow abuse to flourish, like blaming the victim, excusing the abuser's behavior, or just looking the other way, because silence is complicity.
This deep dive has been so insightful, but also really, really heavy. It makes me wonder, could Anitra's death have been prevented? What could have been done differently?
That's a question that I think sticks with all of us long after the gavel falls and the verdict is read. And while we can't go back and change the past, we can definitely learn from it. Anitra's story is a stark reminder that we all need to be vigilant, informed, and compassionate. We need to be upstanders, not bystanders.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the murder of Anitra Gunn, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Domestic violence, I mean, it thrives in silence and isolation. If you see something, say something. If you need help, please reach out. There are resources out there. You're not alone.
Thank you so much for, taking the time to talk us through this case. It's been incredibly complex and heartbreaking. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this issue. Educate yourselves, support those organizations that are working to end domestic violence, and most importantly, be a voice for change in your community. Remember, every single one of us has a role to play in creating a world free from violence and abuse.